The German Navy called U-boot duty the most prestigious assignment available to an enlisted man in the Kriegsmarine. That was the official position, stated plainly in the personnel guidelines issued by the Oberkommando der Marine in 1939, and reinforced by the culture Admiral Karl Dönitz built around his submarine force from the first day of the war. U-boot crews were described as the Graue Wölfe, the Grey Wolves. They were the men who struck first, who moved invisibly, who took the war to the enemy's coastline while the surface fleet maintained its distance. They were elite, selected, honored. Young men from Bremen, Hamburg, Kiel, from coastal towns that had sent men to sea for generations, were told they had been chosen, that the assignment was a mark of distinction, that they would prove themselves in the purest form of naval warfare the ocean permitted. The recruitment posters showed men in white-topped caps standing on the bridge of a surfaced boat, scanning the Atlantic horizon. They looked like hunters. They looked like men who controlled something. What the Oberkommando der Marine did not include in those personnel guidelines was the number that defined what U-boot duty actually cost the men assigned to it. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boot crews between 1939 and 1945, 28,000 were killed in action. 70%. Not wounded, not captured. Dead. Most of them somewhere on the floor of the North Atlantic, the Bay of Biscay, or the waters surrounding the Allied convoy routes that the U-boot arm had been ordered to sever. The men who climbed the conning tower hatch of a Type 7 U-boot in 1942 were stepping into a machine the naval staff had privately calculated was likely to be destroyed, in waters the enemy was learning to control, against an Allied anti-submarine capability that was improving faster than German submarine technology could counter it. The honor was real. The selection was genuine. The expectation that most of them would not come home was never stated aloud. Understanding what those men actually lived through requires beginning not with the combat, but with the machine they lived inside. Because the machine's specific design told the complete story of what the Kriegsmarine had decided it needed from these men, and what it had decided it could afford to ignore. A Type 7C U-boot, the model that formed the backbone of the Atlantic campaign and fought in every theater the submarine war reached, measured 67 meters from bow to stern. That is 220 feet. Roughly 2/3 the length of an American football field. Inside that length, 44 to 52 men lived, ate, slept, and operated one of the most complex weapon systems the Second World War produced. The pressure hull, the steel cylinder that separated the crew from the Atlantic Ocean, had an interior diameter of approximately 4.7 meters, 15 feet across. That is the internal space, 15 feet of diameter in which everything happened. The hull plating was 18.5 millimeters of high tensile steel, less than 3/4 of an inch. That number is worth pausing on. A Type 7C was rated to a working depth of 200 meters. Test dives had confirmed structural integrity to 250 meters. The crush depth, the depth at which the pressure hull would collapse, was calculated at approximately 295 meters. The difference between maximum safe operating depth and the depth at which the hull would implode was 95 meters. The time available to a crew to respond to an uncontrolled descent through those 95 meters was measured in seconds. The crew knew this number. Not from official briefings. The Kriegsmarine did not distribute crush depth calculations to enlisted ratings. They knew it the way men know things in enclosed spaces, from the sounds the hull made at depth, from the way the hull plating visibly deformed under pressure as the boat dove deeper, from the groaning of the frames that the engineering watch could feel through the deck plates beneath their boots. The two-man diesel engines that drove the boat on the surface each produced 1,400 horsepower. On the surface, a Type 7 could make 17.7 knots. Respectable, fast enough to position for attack, fast enough to disengage from surface threats under most conditions. Submerged, the two AEG electric motors drew from a battery bank of 62 cells, generating 7.6 knots maximum, with an endurance of approximately 80 nautical miles at that speed before the batteries required recharging, which meant the boat had to surface. It had to put itself above the waterline, visible, audible, detectable by radar, in order to run the diesels that recharged the batteries that made submerged operation possible. This fundamental operational requirement, surface to recharge, was the structural vulnerability that Allied anti-submarine forces spent 4 years learning to exploit. By 1943, they had learned it well enough that surfacing in the North Atlantic or the Bay of Biscay had become a calculation about acceptable risk rather than standard procedure. The men operating the machinery that required them to surface understood this calculation with the specific clarity that comes from being the one required to do the surfacing. Before the combat, there was the existence, and the existence began with the smell. Every man who served on a Type 7 U-boot described it the same way. Not because their accounts were coordinated, they weren't. Because the smell was specific and permanent, and unlike anything the men had encountered in any other context of their lives. Diesel fuel permeated everything. The engines that drove the boat were separated from the crew spaces by bulkheads, but bulkheads in a submarine are not airtight partitions in any meaningful sense for the purposes of smell. Diesel exhaust, diesel residue, diesel absorbed into the metal surfaces over years of operation. It was the base layer of everything. Over that, mold. A Type 7 at sea for 3 weeks in North Atlantic conditions collected condensation on every metal surface. The hull plating that was 15 degrees Celsius below the air temperature inside the boat in cold Atlantic waters acted as a continuous cold surface against warm, humid interior air. Water ran down the bulkheads. It pooled in the bilges. It soaked into the bunks, into the clothing stored in nets above the torpedoes, into the bread stored in the forward torpedo room. The bread developed mold within 10 days. Standing orders said to cut off the mold and eat the rest. The cook followed these orders. The men ate the rest. And over all of it, 50 men who had not bathed in 3 weeks. Fresh water on a Type 7 was allocated with a precision that reflected the reality of the machine's priorities. The boat carried approximately 12.5 tons of fresh water. Drinking required roughly 1.5 liters per man per day minimum in temperate conditions, more in the tropics, where interior temperatures regularly exceeded 50 degrees Celsius, and the engineering watch lost multiple kilograms of body weight per shift simply through sweating. After drinking water, cooking water. After cooking, essential mechanical uses. After that, nothing remained for personal hygiene. Bathing on a U-boot at sea was not rationed. It was not scheduled for specific days or limited to particular crew members. It did not exist. Men at sea for 8, 10, 12 weeks, the standard Atlantic patrol duration, wiped themselves down with rags when possible, and accepted the accumulation otherwise. The specific combination of diesel, unwashed bodies, mold, and the particular biology of a sealed metal environment produced an atmosphere that visitors boarding German U-boots after the war described with a consistency that left no ambiguity about what they had encountered. The men aboard had stopped detecting it within the first week. Sleep operated by the same logic of scarcity. A Type 7 carried between 44 and 52 men. It had 36 bunks. This was not an oversight. It was a deliberate design decision based on the understanding that a submarine watch rotation meant a significant portion of the crew was always on duty. The bunks that existed were shared. One man sleeping while another stood watch, then exchanging. Kaylee watch. The men called it hot bunking, climbing into a bunk that the previous occupant had just vacated, still warm from the previous body, in a compartment where the temperature varied between freezing condensation in the North Atlantic and unbearable heat in the engine room adjacent spaces. The watch rotation was officially 4 hours on, 8 hours off. In practice, the 8 hours off was not 8 hours of sleep. It was 8 hours during which sleep was theoretically possible when not required at action stations, when not required for maintenance, when not disrupted by depth charge attacks or emergency maneuvers, or the general quarters alarm that required every man to his station regardless of his position in the watch cycle. During the Guadalcanal campaign, the crew logs of American destroyers recorded general quarters alarms averaging 11 times per 24 hours. U-boot crews in the North Atlantic in 1942 and 1943 recorded a different kind of disruption. Not the alarm, but the sound. The hydrophones. The specific, unmistakable sound of destroyer propellers detected on the passive sonar equipment carried by every U-boot. A sound that every man aboard learned to identify within his first patrol. A sound that, once heard at close range, was never forgotten regardless of how many years passed after the war ended. The engineering watch that detected destroyer propellers at close range while the boat was submerged had between 90 seconds and 4 minutes to determine the contact's bearing and speed, pass the information to the commander, and begin the evasive maneuver that might change the geometry of the attack. 90 seconds. In some engagements, less. The men in their hot bunks heard the hydrophone operator's call. They were at their stations before they were fully awake. The weapon that made U-boots lethal carried its own particular danger inside the boat that the official specifications did not address directly, and that the crews who worked near it understood with an intimacy most of them would have preferred not to have. The Type 7 carried up to 14 torpedoes. 14 weapons, each 7.16 meters long and 533 millimeters in diameter, fitted with a warhead containing between 280 and 358 kilograms of hexanite explosive. They lived in the forward torpedo room, 4 in the tubes, 4 more on the deck plates beneath the crew's bunks, in the space between the tubes and the pressure hull. 6 more stored in external containers. The men whose bunks were in the forward torpedo room, the ratings assigned to that space, slept directly above the reserve torpedoes. The mattresses of the folding bunks rested on the torpedo bodies themselves when the rack was down. This was not a secret. It was not hidden from the crew. It was simply the physical reality of a machine designed to carry maximum offensive capability in minimum volume, with crew comfort treated as the variable adjusted to make the mathematics work. The specific danger that required the most discipline was not the torpedoes themselves, though a torpedo warhead detonating inside a pressure hull would have produced an outcome with no survivors, but the battery bank. The 62-cell battery installation that provided electric propulsion for submerged operation produced hydrogen gas as a byproduct of normal operation. Hydrogen, in concentrations above 4% of air volume, is explosive. The batteries required continuous ventilation to prevent accumulation to dangerous levels. At depth, when surface ventilation was impossible, the engineering watch monitored hydrogen concentration with instruments whose readings they were required to report hourly to the commander. The specific reading that required immediate attention was 3%. Not because 3% was dangerous in itself, because the margin between 3% and explosive concentration in a sealed metal environment with limited ventilation was small enough that the hourly reporting interval was not always sufficient to prevent the concentration from crossing it before the next measurement. U-boot commanders whose engineering watches reported hydrogen readings above 2.5% faced a specific calculation: stay deep and manage the accumulation, or surface and accept the tactical risk. Some chose to surface, some did not. The outcomes of both decisions were documented in the war diaries of the boats that survived to submit them. The atmosphere below 100 meters had its own distinct character, independent of hydrogen. Oxygen concentration declined as the crew breathed. CO2 accumulated. The Kali Patrone cartridges, calcium hydroxide canisters that absorb CO2 from circulated air, extended the breathable life of the sealed atmosphere, but not indefinitely. After 18 hours submerged with the boat at silent running, minimal crew movement, minimal equipment operation, a man attempting to light a cigarette match would find the match would not ignite. The oxygen concentration had dropped below the level required for combustion. The men had adapted to this environment in the way the human body adapts to gradual change, through headaches that became normal, through the specific dullness that comes from breathing recycled air for hours, through a fatigue that was different in character from simple sleep deprivation, slower, heavier, harder to locate as coming from outside the body. They stood their watches. They tracked their hydrophone contacts. They read their battery gauges and their hydrogen monitors. They did this in an atmosphere that the aviation medicine literature of the period would have classified as borderline hypoxic. They did it because the boat required it. There is a month in the history of the U-boot war that the Kriegsmarine came to call Schwarzer Mai, Black May, May 1943. In 31 days, Allied anti-submarine forces sank 41 German U-boots. 41 boats. Approximately 1,800 men. Admiral Dönitz, reviewing the operational reports that arrived at his headquarters in Paris across those 31 days, did the mathematics that his commanders in the field were performing in real time from a different position. He concluded, on May 24, 1943, that the Battle of the Atlantic had been lost in its current form. He ordered the withdrawal of the main U-boot force from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The boats that had not yet been sunk received the recall signal. They turned south and west, toward the Bay of Biscay and the French Atlantic ports that had been their operating bases since 1940. The transit of the Bay of Biscay in May 1943 was not a withdrawal. It was a corridor. Allied Coastal Command had concentrated long-range patrol aircraft, Liberators, Halifaxes, Sunderlands equipped with centimetric radar that the German radar detection equipment could not detect, specifically to cover the Bay of Biscay transit routes. The boats that surfaced to charge batteries in the Bay of Biscay in May 1943 were detected by radar, in many cases, before their own lookouts could identify the attacking aircraft. The standard procedure for a U-boot attacked on the surface by aircraft had been, until 1943, to dive immediately. Dive faster than the attacking aircraft could close the range. Get below periscope depth before the depth charges arrived. This procedure required approximately 35 seconds from the order to dive to the boat being below safe depth. An aircraft closing at 200 knots from a detection range of 3 miles had approximately 54 seconds of flight time to the target. The mathematics were workable. They were not comfortable, but they were workable. The centimetric radar changed the mathematics. A Liberator with ASV Mark III radar could detect a surfaced U-boot at 8 miles. At 200 knots, that was 2 minutes and 24 seconds of flight time. Subtract 35 seconds for the dive, the aircraft had 1 minute and 49 seconds of attack approach against a surfaced target before it submerged. That was enough time. U-441 was on transit through the Bay of Biscay on May 24, 1943, the same day Dönitz issued his withdrawal order, when she was attacked by a Sunderland from 201 Squadron RAF. Her commander, Oberleutnant José Klaus Hartmann, had chosen to fight on the surface rather than dive, following the updated tactical directive that had been issued to boats with enhanced anti-aircraft armament. The Sunderland's crew released depth charges across U-441's position. The boat was not sunk, but 11 of her crew were killed or wounded in the exchange, and the damage she sustained required her to limp into Brest under emergency conditions. Of the 41 boats lost in Black May, the majority of crews left no survivors to document what their final minutes had contained. The ones who did survive described a specific experience that repeated across every account. The moment when the radar warning receiver that was supposed to alert them to incoming radar emissions produced no warning, and the aircraft appeared from a direction no lookout had been watching, and the order to dive came simultaneously with the sound of the aircraft's engines. 35 seconds. Some boats made it. some did not. The operational record does not fully distinguish between them in terms of crew performance. The boats that did not make it in May 1943 did not, in most cases, fail because of crew error. They failed because the mathematics had changed. The culture that developed inside U-boot crews was shaped by a reality that had no institutional language for itself. The Kriegsmarine did not have a concept equivalent to what American military psychology would later call combat fatigue. A man was fit for duty or he was not. The evaluation was binary, conducted by the boat's medical officer, when one was embarked, which was not always, or by the commander's own assessment. There was no intermediate category. And yet, the men who completed multiple patrols in the North Atlantic between 1942 and 1943 were not the same men who had departed on their first. The change was visible to everyone aboard, and discussable by no one within the formal structure of their service. What the men had developed instead was a specific internal mathematics. Every man aboard a U-boot performing the North Atlantic run in 1942 and 1943 knew the loss rate. Not from official briefings. The Kriegsmarine did not share cumulative casualty statistics with enlisted ratings. From the dock. From watching which boats came back and which did not. From the specific absence of men they had trained with, men they had served with on previous patrols, men whose names were attached to boats that had left port and not returned. The informal calculation that the men performed was simple and brutal and performed continuously. Given the loss rate they could observe, how many of the men currently visible on this dock would be standing on any dock again? Petty Officer Herbert Mobius, a torpedo mechanic who served on U-552 under Commander Erich Topp between 1941 and 1943, described this calculation in testimony recorded for the German Naval Archive in 1971. He said the men did not discuss the calculation aloud. They performed it individually, privately, then reported to their stations. He said that after the third patrol, the calculation had become a reflex. Not pessimism, mathematics. The specific rituals that U-boot crews developed to manage this calculation were not superstitions in the formal sense. They were practical anchors to a future that the mathematics suggested might not exist. Men wrote letters before departure that were left sealed with family members, not last letters specifically, but letters understood by everyone involved to be contingent. They kept personal objects, of a kind the Kriegsmarine had no regulation about. A photograph wedged between a pipe and the bulkhead above a bunk. A stone from a beach near home, kept in a uniform pocket. Objects that had no tactical value and that the space constraints of a Type 7 made almost impossible to justify. They kept them anyway. The relationship between experienced crew members and new arrivals followed a pattern that commanders documented in their war diaries with a consistency suggesting it was universal. An experienced man joining a boat from a crew that had been lost, a survivor assigned to a replacement billet, was assessed by the existing crew not for his technical qualifications, those were assumed. He was assessed for the specific, indefinable quality that the men called Bootserfahrung, boat experience. It was not trainable in any conventional sense. It was the accumulation of patrols, the ability to read the sounds of the machinery and know when something was developing before the gauges confirmed it, the ability to interpret the commander's manner at the periscope and know whether the tactical situation was manageable or something else, the ability to stand a night watch in the control room and feel, through the boat's motion and the quality of the hydrophone operator's attention, whether the water ahead held something. When men with this quality were lost, the boats that received replacements without it were measurably different machines. Not technically deficient, qualitatively diminished. The commanders knew this and wrote about it. The naval staff received those reports, acknowledged them, and continued sending boats out with whatever crews were available because the operational requirement exceeded the supply of experienced men. This was the institutional reality that the recruitment posters had not depicted. By the autumn of 1943, the strategic position of the U-boot arm had changed in a way that the men in the boats understood before the naval staff acknowledged it officially. They were no longer hunters. The specific technology that produced this shift was not a single weapon or a single tactical development. It was a convergence. Centimetric radar that the boats could not detect, high-frequency direction-finding equipment on Allied escort vessels that could locate a U-boot from its radio transmissions, increasingly effective depth charge patterns, and the emergence of dedicated hunter-killer groups, escort carrier task forces built specifically around the mission of finding and destroying U-boots rather than simply protecting convoys. The boats that had been the gray wolves of the North Atlantic convoy routes in 1940 and 1941 were operating in 1943 and 1944 against a surveillance infrastructure that could detect them at ranges they could not see and track them with a persistence that their battery endurance could not outlast. A U-boot pursued by an experienced hunter-killer group faced a specific form of endurance test that no training had fully prepared any crew to perform. The boat dove. The escorts held contact on their ASDIC, the British sound-ranging equipment that could track a submerged submarine within a defined accuracy range. The escorts dropped depth charges. The pattern was adjusted based on the ASDIC return. The boat maneuvered. The escorts maintained contact. This could continue for hours. The depth charges that Allied escorts had available in 1944 were substantially improved from the weapons of 1942. The Mark X depth charge, the Hedgehog, a head-throwing mortar, the Squid, triple-barreled a head-throwing mortar. Each weapon increased the probability of achieving lethal proximity. Each iteration of Allied ASW technology required German crews to survive patterns that their predecessors had not encountered. A depth charge detonating within 50 meters of a Type 7 U-boot was not necessarily lethal. It was always catastrophic in the specific sense of what it did to the men inside. The concussive shock transmitted through the water and into the hull was experienced not as an explosion in the conventional sense, not as a blast in open air, but as the boat being struck by something enormous, simultaneously, from all directions. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation dislodged from bulkheads and filled the interior with a choking powder. Gauges smashed. Equipment that was not secured flew across compartments. Men who were not braced were thrown. And then, the damage assessment. The engineering watch checked every compartment. Flooding, if it was occurring, was categorized by rate. A slow seep could be managed. A fast flood could not. The time available to a crew to make this assessment and respond was determined by the depth of the boat, the rate of flooding, and whether the boat's pumps could overcome the ingress. The men who survived multiple depth charge attacks described the specific quality of the waiting between attacks. After the first pattern, before the second. The hydrophone operator tracking the escort's propellers above, turning, coming back. The boat at silent running, minimum crew movement, equipment off. The air thickening from the closed atmosphere. Men who had been through this more than once described learning to separate the sound of the attack from its meaning, training themselves to hear the water pressure wave arriving and respond with physical action before the cognitive assessment of what was happening could produce the response that would slow them down. This was not a skill taught in the training establishment. It was a skill that men developed in the boats, across patrols, at a cost that the loss statistics measured imperfectly, because the men who developed it most fully were also the men most likely to be in the boats that were in the positions where developing it was necessary, and the men in those positions were dying at rates that made the accumulation of the skill progressively more difficult to sustain across the force as a whole. By 1944, Dönitz had 130 U-boots operational in the Atlantic. He had lost more than 500 boats since the beginning of the war. The replacement boats were crewed by men with insufficient patrol experience operating against an enemy whose anti-submarine capability had been purpose-built around destroying them. The math, by that point, required no calculation. One of the men who understood the math clearly, who had performed the calculation at the dock before each patrol and arrived at numbers he did not share with anyone, was Maschinenmat Karl Brandt of Kiel. Brandt was 22 years old when he reported to U-552 at Saint-Nazaire in January 1942, assigned as a machinist's mate in the engineering watch. He had come from a family of shipbuilders. His father had worked in the Kiel yards since before Karl was born. He had requested U-boot duty because the machinery interested him. He had never considered, he said later, what the machinery would require of him in return. He served 3 patrols on U-552 under Commander Erich Topp. He was present on the bridge the night U-552 sank the American destroyer USS Reuben James, the first American warship lost in the Atlantic, 6 weeks before the United States entered the war. He said afterward that he had not felt what he expected to feel. He completed his 3rd patrol in September 1942. He was transferred to U-boat training duties in the Baltic, a posting that removed him from the operational Atlantic at a moment when the operational Atlantic was consuming boats at rates that the replacement pipeline could not sustain. He survived the war. He returned to Kiel in 1945 to a city that the same bomber forces whose ships and aircraft he had hunted in the Atlantic had reduced to 70% rubble. His father's yard was gone. The neighborhood where he had grown up was gone. He found work in the reconstruction, then in the new West German Merchant Marine as an engineer on cargo vessels in the Baltic and North Sea runs. He worked those routes for 31 years. His family said he never spoke about the Atlantic patrols in specific terms. They knew he had served on U-552. They knew Erich Topp's name. They knew U-552 had survived when most boats of her type had not. They did not know about the calculation he had performed on the dock before each patrol. They did not know about the quality of the air after 18 hours submerged, the way a match would not ignite when the oxygen dropped below a certain level. They did not know the specific sound of destroyer propellers heard through the hull at close range while running silent at 150 meters. His son, in an account recorded for the German U-boot Museum at Altenbruch in 1989, described his father as a man who was attentive to machinery in a way that seemed disproportionate to what the machinery required. He checked engines before departure on cargo runs when the engines had already been checked. He listened to the sounds of a vessel at sea with an attention his colleagues found excessive and his son found impossible to explain, until, much later, he understood what kind of listening his father had learned to do, and what the cost of not listening carefully enough had been, and why a man who had developed that particular form of attention in that particular environment could not simply set it aside because the environment had changed. Karl Brandt died in 1991 at the age of 71. He had spent the last years of his working life on Baltic cargo routes, on water he described in the one interview he gave to the U-boot Museum as klein, small. Small compared to the Atlantic. The interviewer asked him what he remembered most about the boats. He said he remembered the sound the hull made at depth when a depth charge detonated within range. Not close enough to cause damage, just within range. He said it sounded like the ocean deciding something. He paused for a long time. He said, the ocean had not decided anything yet on those occasions, but you could hear it considering the question. That was what he remembered most. Not the tonnage sunk, not the patrols completed, not the awards or the commanders or the boats. The sound of the ocean considering the question. And the answer it gave to 28,000 of the men who had served alongside him at the bottom of waters that still hold them.